Hey, Dogg of Dogg from Air here. I'm making a video about racist statues, which is not a sentence I ever expected to formulate in my lifetime, but here we are. I am not at all stoked to be making this video. Been following the situation for a while, and I honestly didn't expect the statues to ever come down. But then one came down in the middle of the night, another one came down also in the middle of the night, and at that point I decided I needed to make a video. And then the third one came down just right away again in the middle of the night, and so here I am. I've done quite a bit of research, but I'm still unsatisfied with what I've turned up. If anyone expresses any interest in this topic, I'll be happy to do some more digging, but this is what I have. I would not be making a video on these statues unless I had lived in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was not born in the South. I don't really have much of a stake in the identity, like the Southern identity. But here I am. And I have gotten to the point where I realized that if I didn't make a video about the statues, I would feel guilty later. I am not a racist. I don't think it's cool to own people. I don't think it's cool to glorify racism or owning people. I think that is a dark period of our history which we need to remember and feel grateful that we are not in anymore. I spent a lot of time playing jazz music and studying jazz music. I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of jazz musicians are black, so it's kind of hard to hate black people and also emulate them. It's kind of hard to think that white people are better than black people and also think that black people created something original. So that is extremely offensive to me. I do think that black people, well, I'll back up and I'll say, I think it's important to acknowledge that suffering is universal, and yet in the context of suffering, black people in the United States have had a unique, to say the least, experience that needs to be addressed, and it hasn't been fully addressed. So I completely agree with that. And I also completely agree that if you're going to have a government intervention, it ought to be in favor of the have-nots. It ought to be in favor of leveling the playing field. I'm going to have a drink of water now. Now, where I disagree is on whether or not there ought to be government intervention. And I think it's very easily demonstrated that government intervention has done more harm than good. There has been reams and reams of information published on this topic by people smarter than I. I'm going to recommend two people. One is Dr. Thomas Sowell, a black man, for the record, who has written copiously on the subject of the statistical measurements of the effects of racism and discrimination. The other is Stefan Molyneux, whom I don't agree with 100%, but he has a really enlightening video on slavery, which I will link to here. So I'm not going to go too far in depth into what those two fine gentlemen have discussed, but let's go right back to the Civil War, okay? 1857, prior to the Civil War, was something called the Dred Scott Decision. So a lot of people out there think that this thing called judicial activism is a great thing, you know, when they agree with it. This is the first Oh, sorry, so what judicial activism means is a judge is coming in and saying, well, the law says this, but I really think that the intent of the law was more over this a little bit. So because we have a common law system where court law, case law, sets a precedent and that affects how further rulings are going to, pan out, that can be extremely influential in the history of a nation. So anyway, the Dred Scott decision, basically what happened is a white slave owner took his slave to a state where slavery was illegal, and the reasoning was that because slavery was illegal in that state, the slave was then free because there was no such thing as slavery, so how could it exist? And the Supreme Court intervened and they said, well, because he was made a slave by the government of this state, the federal government is going to come in and overrule the law of this other state and say he's still a slave. Okay? Another big thing that led to the Civil War were the fugitive slave laws, which were a whole slew of laws saying that the neighboring free states would have to return any escaped slaves to their owners. So the idea of a slave escaping from slavery, going to a place that didn't have slavery or didn't want slaves there, and being free, or having passage to another place, that was overruled again by state interference. And so that again, I mean, we're talking about the federal government coming in and overruling the states and imposing its own law. And in this case, it was really to the detriment of civil rights, despite what anyone's going to tell you. So now I'm going to talk about something really cute called the Confiscation Act of 1861. So we've got this idea that the Civil War was fought to free the slaves, and there's a little bit to that. There's not nothing to it, but what happened in the Confiscation Act of 1861 after the start of the Civil War? Well, it turned out that in the body of this law, any slaves which were captured by the Union Army would become the property of the United States government. Not free, property. Spoils of war. In response to this law, on May 9th, 1862, Union General David Hunter freed all the slaves under his command. So how did Lincoln respond to that? By canceling the order and returning those slaves to the status of property. Alright, so as I hinted to, there's some some discussion over what the purpose of the Civil War was. It's interesting, as Stefan Molyneux points out in his video, that no war has ever been fought over slavery, so that's a little bit suspicious to me that they're saying that this singular war, which is so singular in our national identity, was fought for slavery, when that's the only war ever. I think very few people would argue that slavery was long for this world, and of course now we'll never know, but Brazil, I believe, legalized slavery, freed their slaves right around the same time period. Basically, technology, machines were coming in, and they were making it not possible, not economically viable to have slaves, and so it was just going the way of the dodo, if you will. There's also the contention that Lincoln said, he would handle the war by freeing all the slaves. He would handle the war by ensuring slavery in perpetuity. He didn't really matter, he didn't really care. There's also the idea that he wanted to deal with slaves by sending them back to Africa, and we have the the current country of Liberia as testament to that interesting little piece of history. Nevertheless, we do have the fact that every Confederate state mentioned slavery in its own Declaration of Secession. So that's something that we have to discuss. But things are not always as they seem. And if you look at a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle, you might see a little bit more about what caused that. So who were the Knights of the Golden Circle? It was a group which was bankrolled by British Freemasons, and apparently the Freemasons told the Knights of the Golden Circle that they would be very happy to bankroll them in exchange for them declaring secession, and then they would give them the money and the arms to be able to successfully do that, which they then did, of course. But apparently the real goal was to split the United States into two countries, which would be weaker, and then they could use something like a central bank to come in and take over both of those countries. So, where have we heard that before? At any rate, in 1857, the Knights of the Golden Circle changed its name to the Ku Klux Klan. So Ku Klux is similar to Kuklos, I believe, which is the Greek word for circle. They are with us to this very day. Now, in my opinion, though, the worst of what has been done to black people in the United States is in the area of medical experimentation. Now, a lot of people are somewhat familiar with this. We've got cases like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where at least hundreds of black people were deliberately infected with syphilis and then told they were being treated, but not. And they basically just watched and observed the course of the disease, slowly take the lives of these poor innocent people. We also have Henrietta Lacks, who was admitted with, I believe, uterine cancer, and her doctor sewed, radium rods into her body in order to conduct some crazy experiment. He said he was curing her, but the result of this was that they created an immortal line of cancer cells, so undying cancer cells that they could take out of Henrietta's body and inject them into another patient to give that patient cancer if their immune system was weak enough. So if you look at the location of some of our oldest and most prominent research hospitals, you'll find proximity to African American populations. I think that's interesting. We've got plenty of cases of black people being used as guinea pigs in research experiments. And not only medical experiments, but social experiments. And that's the name of the game here, folks. Social engineering. So with black people, they have, they have an isolated group that they're able to, do weird stuff to before they roll it out onto the population at large. So look at the trends in the African American population, and you'll see what they're trying to do on the population as a whole. Now, that exists because black people and white people tend not to associate with each other, and that's true, and I don't like that. But if you think that the government or the powers that be are tending towards reducing that trend, I would point you towards the direction of a little phenomenon known as the safe space. And I would have you cross-reference that with the topic of segregation. It is an indisputable fact that as a society, despite 60 years of the civil rights movement, our society is becoming more segregated, not less. So on to the statues. I have to say that there are a lot of black people I respect more than Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, or Jefferson Davis. In fact, I really don't know who P.G.T. Beauregard is. I saw his birthplace walking around town, but I don't know who he is. I didn't even bother to look him up. I mean, he's a general, I know that much. So, if someone were saying to me, would you like a statue of Louis Armstrong, or would you like a statue of Robert E. Lee? I would say, of course, I would like a statue of Louis Armstrong, if you're offering me two choices. If we're talking about moving a statue to a place of lesser prominence and replacing it with another statue, I would basically be totally fine with that. So if we said that, like the Robert E. Lee statue, we can't have that right in the middle of a circle, you know, he's controversial, I would understand that. We're going to put him somewhere else on like a neutral ground, you know, or if we say Jefferson Davis, we can't have him right at the intersection. You know, we're going to put him a little bit farther down, we're going to replace him with who, Jelly Roll Morton, you know. I don't care, that's fine. The thing is there, if you're building more statues, if you're talking about building more statues, that is an entirely different conversation from the one that we are having today. We are talking purely about taking old statues down and doing God knows what with them. Okay, so the point is that the people who are objecting to the statues are not themselves involved in the process of making new statues. They are neither carvers nor people who organize statues to be put up somewhere, whatever you call that. They are basically they are literally doing nothing more than sitting on the sidelines and bitching. Alright, so it may be hard for certain people to believe like this, but we are living in a world where the left has been in power for a very long time. Generations, in fact. So, what we are seeing today is a result, a consequence of an ideology which does not have the power to create, only to destroy. Now, one of these monuments, the white supremacy monument, is personally offensive to me. You know, it's a pretty gross monument if you look at it. But here's what I have to say about that. I must have walked by it several times and never even noticed it, because it's in an inconspicuous location next to a flood wall, which is taller than it. So along with, you know, probably all the other statues, except for the Lee Circle, I wouldn't even know about it unless someone had caused this big hubbub. So you can call that white privilege, but I question the effect of a statue, the mere existence of a statue, regardless of its history, on any individual's well-being. This brings up a point which I was discussing with my good friend Sick Buns, who I hope to have on the channel shortly. The concept of value and the recognition of such. I was telling him about a recent trip to Chicago I took, where I had the opportunity to visit a World War II German submarine which is located there. I quite enjoyed it because I'm a bit of a World War II history buff, so it was really neat for me to be able to see it, and it caused me to reflect on the notion of value. So what is value? Value means that you enjoy something or want it in your life. You can see that other people might like it as well. So, for example, the submarine is going to cause people to go to Chicago. Portland has things like the International Rose Test Garden, which is a park that the city invested in to attract people to its city. New Orleans has cultural value in spades, We've got the French Quarter, City Park, we've got a zoo, we've got the National World War II Museum, we've got jazz clubs, of course, all kinds of food from po' boys to beignets to gumbo to you name it. And there's a notion that my friend Sigbuns, I remember him saying to me that, you know, I've got this idea, since you're saying this to me, that we used to, as a people, recognize value, and somehow we've lost that. So I would submit that something has been lost, something has been destroyed, and in its place, we have something called pop culture, which is the best that the left, which again cannot create, can do. So even in the great city of New Orleans, which is famous for its cultural artifacts, we have the infiltration of pop culture in things such as the crew of Chewbacca, which is a crew that dresses up as Star Wars characters. So if you're not familiar with what a crew is, crews basically came from the carnival tradition. Crews organized parades, and they were originally secret societies. That is, you weren't allowed to know who was in them. That stipulation has since been lifted. And they have nowadays a bit of a broader definition as just basically a mutual aid society, people coming together. And it used to be particular neighborhoods, particular families and friends, with a particular history and custom that went into each crew. And it probably goes without saying that the crew of Chewbacca is a bunch of white people. A lot of the original crews were black people, so that's an interesting point that I also don't feel that the protesters of the monument are addressing. But I digress. Another interesting thing that happened here in New Orleans was a Pikachu statue, which you might have heard of. So Danny and I were living just by where the statue showed up mysteriously one day. The story behind it is that some people saw, imagine this, a vacant pedestal where a statue used to be, and they recognized that the city didn't have the money to put anything there, and so they said, hey, I'm going to make a statue of something I like, which happened to be a Pikachu statue. Now, I'm going to touch on the fact that Pokemon is a perfect example of social engineering. You've got people glued to their phones walking around all day. It was developed by a subsidiary of Google. It's a little bizarre. I'm not super stoked to have a statue of that, but, I do respect that someone put a lot of work into that, and I did enjoy seeing it. So the National World War II Museum, which I just mentioned, I recently had a chance to tour it, and that experience reminded me of some context for the racial discussion in America. Now, of course, the museum itself did not remind me of anything, because the museum itself is a pure propaganda, America is great kind of a thing. But because I'm an erudite man, I know that World War II was stupendously, egregiously racist. And it was racist, it was what you would call scientifically racist. So for example, black people were not allowed to give blood because the scientists were not sure that they were the same species as white people. President Roosevelt had a letter opener made from a Japanese man's jawbone. Don't take my word for this, look it up yourself. U.S. Marines who were stationed in the Pacific Front were using Japanese skulls to decorate their jeeps, and they were sending Japanese skulls home to their sweethearts. And this was basically because they didn't think that Japanese people were human. This was like novel. Like you would not send, they didn't send German skulls home to their sweethearts. If you want to look into the history of African Americans in World War II, which I suggest that you do, check out the Triple Nickels who spent the entire war fighting forest fires, which were caused by Japanese balloon bombs throughout the West Coast, you might look at their involvement in the fighting off the Japanese on the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, which the Japanese held and fortified for over a year in both cases. Did you know this? Do you think that Black Lives Matter knows this? Do you think that taking down some racist statues is going to help people to know this? Personally, I do not, and personally this fact offends me. If you think that the mainstream media or your academia or your liberal politicians are in any way in touch with anything at all resembling reality, check out where their funding is coming from. Or better yet, check out the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans for some lovely pieces of propaganda. Speaking of lovely, Danny pointed out some things that I missed during our trip to the museum. There's a Nazi propaganda exhibit there right now, which makes great pains of pointing out, I guess, the uniqueness of Nazi propaganda and how it was used to dehumanize Jews. And then you can go into the next exhibit, which is the exhibit in the Pacific Theater, and you can find the Americans dehumanizing the Japanese. She pointed out to me that basically the only super duper atrocious photos in the whole exhibit were photos of Japanese soldiers who had blown their brains out. And these photos were at children's eye level, if that means anything to you. So throughout the whole exhibit there was this real effort to portray the Japanese as suicidal, and it amps up the whole time to, now we're going to go to Iwo Jima, where they're dug in, and look, they're fighting to the last man, they're killing civilians, and of course the inevitability of that whole engagement was, well, we just have to drop atomic bombs on them because these people just won't listen to reason. So, to reiterate, the National World War II Museum is propaganda. Putting up these statues was an act of propaganda. Taking them down is, again, an act of propaganda. It is not adding value to people's lives, nor is it taking it away. An interesting point that some people made online is that you so-and-so racists who are saying that they are erasing history, they are not erasing history. Well, on May 12th, 2017, Mitch Landrieu actually said in Time magazine, quote, "We're actually correcting history." So make of that what you will. At this point, I feel I must reiterate that I feel no personal attachment to these statues. I am not, nor have I ever been, a white Southerner. I understand that it is white Southerners, and not myself, who are being attacked. And while that may not mean anything to some people, it means a lot to them. In connection, I'm going to share a story which Danny told me recently about a conversation she overheard among a group of women who were discussing the taking down of the statues. She overheard one of these women, spoiler alert, it was a white woman, saying something along the lines of that she did not believe in violence, but that these people who opposed the taking down of the statues were racist and therefore inhuman, and that the taboo against violence did not apply to them. So finally, I want to address the leftists of the world. I want to say, look, guys, your movements are being bankrolled by anonymous sources. Your proud deeds are being done in the shadows, in the dead of the night. And I've got to say, if you're proud, be proud. If you believe that what you are doing is right, then act like it. Be happy. Have a parade. You know, and of course they're going to say, oh, well, the right is threatening violence. You know, we're so worried about this, we've got to protect our contractors with body armor and police snipers because they're so violent. But you know what? I mean, the violence, there's been one act of violence, and it was some teenagers with paintballs. And that I'm not condoning that in any way. That's wrong, and that person should be held accountable. But, look at what happened in France with like setting police officers on fire. Look at what happened in Berkeley with fireworks. Talk about violence here. And what we're seeing is classic abusive behavior, where the abuser is blaming the victim, okay? That is what is happening with the modern left. So, look at yourselves. Look at what is happening and realize that this is not we the people, okay? This is leftist politicians looking out for their own butts. So, if only there were this mountain of racist statues which leftist politicians could mine, they would be in power forever. So that brings us to the whodunit portion of the program. Of course, the removals were paid for by an anonymous donor, so that makes it kind of hard to tell who's paying for it. In 2015, a conservative news outlet called The Hayride reported that the donor was a man named John Cummings. He is a local New Orleans attorney. The same day that they reported that, they retracted their statement because they were contacted by someone associated with John Cummings who denied that he was paying for it. Which he would of course do because John Cummings is the owner of a tract of land called the Whitney Plantation, which he has turned into a slavery museum. So it would be a clear conflict of interest on his part. However, John Cummings has made multiple millions of dollars selling properties to the city. He has also been a big personal donor to both Moon Landrieu and Mitch Landrieu's mayoral campaigns. And there are rumors that the statues are intended for his plantation at any rate. There is no concrete plan at this point for the statues, so that's entirely reasonable they could end up there. Now, this anonymous donation was funneled through a group called the Foundation for Louisiana. The foundation was created 6 days after Hurricane Katrina as the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation. Now, I don't know a whole lot about founding non-profit groups, but 6 days does not sound like a lot of time for me. They have, in that time period, donated over $40 million to various interests, so that they're a big player in the local economy. I found a tenuous link to George Soros's Open Society Foundations, but I wasn't able to follow it up. I did find that they had accepted donations from the J.P. Morgan Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, and the Kellogg Foundation. Most interesting, perhaps, is that they also accepted a $250,000 donation from the Edward Wisner Donation Trust, which is administrated by none other than New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu. Several locals have mentioned to me that there's some interesting facts concerning Katrina. For example, it was not a very large hurricane by the time it reached land, and it did not, in fact, reach land in the state of Louisiana, but rather in the neighboring state of Mississippi. So it was only a Category 1 hurricane, by the time it hit here. The damage was all caused by a levee breach, and the breach in fact occurred after the flooding had reached its maximum stage. So there's some talk that they knew it was going to happen, and there's some talk that they had some plans in place for when it did happen, and they basically used the fact of the hurricane as a pretense to roll out their various remodeling plans for the city. So I'm not going to say too much about the Landrieu family, other than Louisiana is famous for its corruption, and these guys are no strangers to it. One interesting point is that Mitch's father, Moon Landrieu, was personally responsible for having the Confederate flag removed from the city council chambers. So whether or not that's a good thing, the family definitely has some skin in the whole racist symbol game. Very interesting point is that Mitch Landrieu's great-grandmother was apparently a black woman. I don't know why I haven't heard this, but I was able to confirm through the website genie.com that her name was Sarentha Mackey, and she was born in 1870. So on to the City Council, which approved the removal of the monuments 6-1. First, we got City Council President Jason Williams, a local attorney who is currently under trial for being accused of providing a cell phone to an inmate he is representing. He recently also appointed a convicted felon to the position of City Alcohol Control Board member. He owes over $100,000 in back taxes as reported by the IRS. He was jailed in 2009 for contempt of court. And he campaigned during Mardi Gras, y'all. You don't do that. Sacred. Alright, next we've got Jared Brossette, who is basically just a career politician as far as I can tell. He is a member of the American Council of Young Political Leaders, and through the former leader of that, a woman named Linda Rotuno, he is connected to the Center for American Progress, which was founded by John Podesta, if you're following the Pizzagate scandal. Next we have LaToya Cantrell. She complained about the process, the debate that is, on the statue removal, but finally acquiesced. She's running for mayor of New Orleans this year. Her husband, as well as herself, is a city attorney, or at least he was, until he was talking to a police officer in court, and a joint fell out of his pocket. A joint fell out of this man's pocket, and he was forced to resign. Ironically, LaToya Cantrell was the council member who put forth the smoking ban, the New Orleans smoking ban, in 2014. Next, we have attorney James Gray, who lost his license to practice law in 2015 because he apparently took money from clients without providing them any work. So, although he can no longer practice law, he can serve as a member of the city council. His wife is a state judge, his daughter is a state senator, and his son-in-law is a commander in the United States Navy. Next up is Susan Guidry. I couldn't find anything bad about her, so good job, Susan. She was involved in reform for marijuana sentencing, and also worked with the New Orleans Police Department to be more lenient towards Mardi Gras Indians. Those guys can get a bit rowdy. Next up we have Nadine Ramsey. She is a judge, and she won her first appointment as a judge, apparently because no one else ran against her, because her cousin Sherman Copeland, who is very influential, somehow convinced them not to run. Finally, we have the sole opponent to the removal, a woman named Stacey Head, who has apparently been a thorn in the side of the city government for quite a while. she has complained vociferously about misallocation of funds by various of the New Orleans city water and sewage boards. Not really sure, but at any rate, these boards retaliated against her, criticizing them by releasing some of her personal emails. So that's how it goes in the beautiful city of New Orleans. So at this point, I'd like to reiterate that I'm basically the kind of guy who is going to say that if someone tells me to take down a statue because they don't like it, because it offends them, I am inclined to take down that statue. There's going to be some instances where that person is being overly sensitive, but I'm inclined to err on the side of, my statue being overly sensitive. It depends on how much work I put into that statue. But there is a real issue underlying all of this stuff, which is the massive infrastructure and societal problems we experience here in the city of New Orleans. So, most glaring example is the crime rate, and specifically the murder rate, which is super duper high here and apparently rising. There were apparently 4 murders on the night that the PGT Beauregard statue in City Park was removed. Wow. So I drive around the city, I see stuff not working quite a bit. There are a ton of potholes. One thing I like is that there's some dude who has apparently been spray painting the name of Robert E. Lee on several of the statues, several of the potholes, in hopes that the city will remove them. So that is very cute. But this brings us to the topic of something called Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. Now this is pretty much just as it sounds. There is a hierarchy of needs. There are things that people need more than other things. And so Maslow was a psychologist, and he was looking at it in the context of psychology. He was saying that if these more basic needs, or if these needs in general are met, a person will be happier and healthier psychologically. So I'm just going to read through them. The basic need is physiological, which means, are you being fed? Are you being sheltered? The next is going to be safety. So are people trying to hurt you? Do you have defense from people who might try to hurt you? Next we have, he calls it love and belonging. So this is like being part of a peer group, having friends, having acquaintances. Next we have esteem, which is the feeling good about yourself. And then finally we have self-actualization, which is providing some sort of a, overall being part of a larger whole, basically, to your life. He taught at the New School for Social Research, which was the direct descendant of the Frankfurt School, which I've talked a little bit about in previous videos. This makes him not only a liberal, but like an arch liberal. So it's curious that the liberals in this particular case of the statues have failed to heed this guy's advice. Now, the delicious irony comes in when I find that Maslow has also given us a maxim known as Maslow's hammer, which you've all heard it before. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So this just applies in spades to the entire leftist agenda, where they really have nothing to offer to people who, they have really nothing to offer in terms of quality of life. All they can do is destroy symbols, attack symbols, destroy history, and on and on and on. Some criticism of the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, according to the Wikipedia article, came from Christina Hoff Sommers, who said that the hierarchy might be culturally biased, and that it might not always play out the same in every culture, which is a little bizarre. but she's a leftist. I think it's pretty obvious that people need like food more than they need religion. You know, they need to not die more than they need to feel good about themselves. But I digress. In the Wikipedia article, it also mentioned that Maslow himself had addressed these concerns in his writing, where he basically said that yes, the hierarchy does not always play out the same way, but it's essentially correct. The Wikipedia article also mentioned a study of something like 60,000 people who had been surveyed and had reported that yes, the hierarchy was more or less correct. But I think that the idea that the hierarchy, while more or less correct, is somewhat, the various parts are somewhat interchangeable is precisely the point. So if you want people to be healthy, you know, there's a pyramid where you're going to start with a strong base and build up incrementally towards more and more, you know, complex, rarefied goals. However, if you don't want them to be healthy, you can, and I'm suggesting this is what has been done, you can use this hierarchy or abuse it to give them the idea that they're healthy when they're really not. So there's the quote or misquote of Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake," where the French peasants were starving because they had no bread, and she said as a suggestion, well, let them eat cake instead. We have the Soviet Union where people were starving, but certain of the Politburo, I guess you would say, were trying to give them this great ideology that they were participating in a wonderful restructuring of society along communist principles. You might look at modern materialist culture where life has no meaning for a lot of people, but a lot of people have a lot of stuff. And most to the point, you could look at the city of New Orleans today, where a lot of people don't have health care. There are large parts of the city with no police coverage. The roads and other infrastructure are extremely bad, but at least the city will take down racist statues. This brings up an interesting question to me, which is, why are African American issues considered a national issue? Why are African American issues not considered as particularly relevant to places where African Americans actually live? There are plenty of places that are majority black in the United States. There are plenty of places with 0 black people. And I'm from Oregon, so I can attest to this fact. I feel like we are not treating, in the political discourse, black people as people. I feel like we are, in fact, treating them as a political football to gain control. And wink, wink, nudge, nudge, one of the two parties is more guilty of this than the other. Interestingly, though, you may know that the Republican Party, which is now the dominion of racist white folk, was started as an abolitionist party. So it's, talk about flip-flopping. And then speaking of the Civil War, I mentioned earlier that slavery may not have been a key issue in the Civil War. Well, let me revisit that point. It certainly was a key issue, at least as far as the documents proclaiming secession will attest. But I would submit to you that it was an issue of slavery and not of people. So in other words, slavery was an economic issue. It was not an issue of civil rights or increasing civil rights for black people. So I'm not saying that there are no black people protesting the monuments. I've certainly seen quite a few. I've seen some black leaders, but looking at the internet, looking at the press, looking at the mayor, there are a lot of white people. And living in New Orleans, I have the opportunity to hear people speak about this daily, and one thing I've noticed is that black people seem to be allowed to speak about this issue with a certain nuance. So I've heard black people speak fervently in favor of taking them down, I've heard black people fervently against it, and I've heard black people say that they couldn't care either way, as the gentleman I mentioned earlier. White people, on the other hand, are either racist or not racist, which is devoid of nuance. It is something called black and white thinking, and there's an interesting psychological phenomenon which may explain what's going on here, and that is something called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. So what is Munchausen syndrome? It's basically like hypochondria, where you pretend to be sick in order to get attention. Proxy means that someone else is doing it to you, or someone else is the victim of whatever is happening. So Munchausen syndrome by proxy typically manifests when a mother takes her healthy child to the doctor and tries to get the child diagnosed with something. It's an interesting phenomenon that may help some people understand what's going on. There's an interesting story I was reading today where a man in LA, an African American man, who posted a selfie of his running club in his neighborhood, which had been taken over by white people. And so the upshot is basically, of course, gentrification. White people are moving into formerly African American neighborhoods, and this is terrible for them. And the interesting thing that no one mentions is that there are plenty of urban areas where black people are the majority. They just don't happen to be in California. They happen to be in, like New Orleans is 60% black, Georgia, other parts of the Confederacy where there's also a lot of racist statues. But anyway, another story that comes to mind is from my personal life. Back in Portland a few years ago, I was going down to Lloyd Center, the biggest mall in Oregon. I believe I was going there to buy shoes. So I was walking on the street, and out of nowhere came a giant protest against Monsanto walking down the street. And so because I was particularly woke at this point in my young life, I decided to stand there and try and figure out how many black people were on the sidewalk or were in the protest. The protest was fairly large. It was about 3 blocks long, so maybe 1,000 people. And in that 1,000 people, I counted maybe 2 or 3 black people. I was a little bit chagrined because certainly the issue of bad food affects black people. Clearly, the idea of factory farming and unwholesome food in general is pretty disturbing. And it's an issue which particularly affects African Americans because they tend to have lower incomes, and the lower your income is, the more likely you are to buy cheap food, and the more cheap a piece of food is, basically the worse it's going to be for you. That's pretty obvious. I was befuddled, but I continued on my way to Lloyd Center, where I found, lo and behold, a bunch of black and brown people walking through the mall with their families, shopping and such. Not only did I find black and brown people in droves, but I found the images of black and brown people displayed rather inclusively on the advertising featured in the mall. So it seemed to indicate to me that the leftist movement, in this case, this would be, I guess, an environmentalist movement, but the left in general is more white, less inclusive than mainstream consumer culture. So, what's going on here? These leftist movements, environmentalism, equality, racism, feminism. Instead of bringing people together, they are actually being used, it appears to me, as a divide and conquer tactic. So rather than being used as someone said, a teaching moment to talk about slavery and to be grateful that we no longer have it and to marvel at the thin veneer of civilization on which we all rest and how fragile it is and the great need for it to be protected, we are focusing on the divisive elements of the discourse. And we are saying there's a lot of false equivalencies going around where certain people, I'm not going to name names, but certain people are equating the statue with something like lynching, which nobody likes, or equating the statues with slavery, which is disingenuous, and that turns people off, because nobody likes lynching. As I said, nobody likes slavery. People can relate to the bad things that black people can go through or have gone through, but when you start to talk about things like microaggressions, you really lose people. When you have to have an advanced degree in sociology to understand how people are getting hurt, you lose people. And I get this image of children in my mind walking around looking at these statues and saying, is that a racist statue? Is that a racist statue? Not to trivialize racism in any way, but it is a abstract function of the human mind which is difficult for anyone. And I'm worried that this is where we might be headed. So in closing, I really want to say that I do believe it's getting better. Based on what I know, and I am someone who has jumped through the hoops of what we call conspiracy theory, past propaganda, to hope for a better society. And what I believe is happening right now is that the bad guys are losing. The whatever you want to call them, secret societies, Illuminati, Rothschilds, Rockefellers, to name some, these evil bloodline groups which have been in control of Western civilization for who really knows how long, are finally losing power. And they are taking their disgusting schemes with them. And a great tool for this is the internet, on which you are viewing Dogg from air this very day. Someone observed that a mere 5 years ago, YouTube was nothing but cute cat videos. And look at it now. The bad guys did not believe that people would start to do what they're doing, which is digging into the history, which is publishing facts and studying the reality of our planet. They don't believe this because they have no hope. They cannot create. They can only destroy. But having failed to create, they haven't created anything. They've left us with a giant power vacuum. The world is getting better for everyone except for the people who bought into the crazy leftist version of events. So I'd like to extend my condolences to those people, but you're losing and it's time to make new friends. And also I've got to say that even though the bad guys are losing, that doesn't mean that the good guys will necessarily win. The word of the week for me is pluralism. What we're going to have is a situation where some parts of the world are going to be really, really good. Some parts of the world are going to be really, really bad. Probably even worse than they are right now. And what that's going to depend on is you. We're at a point in history where everything depends on you. And it's time to reconnect with your community, get out there in the world, make new friends, and start making the world whatever it is you want it to be. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Evan Benton for Dogg from Air. So